I sat in the cold, uncomfortable wooden chair of the defendant's table, watching my mother meticulously dab the corners of her eyes with a crumpled tissue. She was not actually crying, of course. Rowena Ravenscroft rarely cried for anyone but herself, and certainly never for me. She was just performing for the judge, trying her hardest to squeeze out fake tears while my father's solicitor passionately argued why I should be legally forced to hand over the home I had worked 6 grueling years to afford. Across the courtroom, my younger sister, Serafina, was slouching in her chair, completely ignoring the gravity of the legal proceedings happening around her. She was scrolling through her phone, her thumb flicking endlessly across the screen, probably looking at high-end furniture catalogs. I could practically see her mentally redecorating my living room, replacing my carefully chosen modern art with whatever cheap, trendy garbage she saw on social media that morning. She wore ripped designer jeans and a tight crop top, apparently unaware or simply uncaring that she was in an actual court of law. My father, Alistair, sat beside my mother, looking incredibly stern and righteous, puffing his chest out like a king, demanding his rightful tribute from a disobedient peasant. When Justice Sylvia Thornton finally had enough of the opposing lawyer's highly theatrical speech about deep family obligations and moral duties, she peered over her thick reading glasses and asked if the defense had any initial response before we proceeded further. I stood up. I could feel my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands surprisingly were completely steady. I walked over to the wooden evidence table in the center of the room and placed a large tablet flat on the surface. Without saying a word, I tapped the screen once. The first video started playing immediately on the court's display monitor. It was high-definition security footage from my luxury building in Canary Wharf, crystal clear, even in the dim light of the hallway. The timestamp on the bottom right corner read April 28th, 17 inches the morning. There was Serafina standing directly in front of my heavy oak front door, aggressively trying to jam a metal bump key into the deadbolt. When the lock failed to turn, she kicked the door frame in frustration and could be heard clearly telling someone off camera, "I will just wait until she gives me the code." My mother's hand, the one holding the tissue to her dry eyes, froze in midair. My father's righteous, arrogant expression melted instantly into absolute ghost-like paleness. The entire courtroom went so terrifyingly silent that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit running in the ceiling. I am Alara Ravenscroft. I am 28 years old, and for my entire life I have been the invisible, unpaid employee in my own family. I spent my childhood watching my parents practically worship my younger sister, treating her like absolute royalty while tossing me the leftover scraps of their time and affection. Growing up in our modest, semi-detached home in the suburbs was a daily masterclass in unequal treatment. I never had a real bedroom. Serafina got the massive master suite at the end of the hall, the one with the beautiful bay window and the huge walk-in wardrobe. Because according to my mother, a growing girl simply needs her space to express herself. I, on the other hand, got the converted storage room right next to the boiler cupboard. It was permanently freezing cold in the winter, suffocatingly hot in the summer, and it always smelled faintly of rust and old dust from the water heater rumbling next door. Whenever I brought home a report card with top marks, making the honor roll every single term without fail, my parents would barely glance at it. They would say, "That is nice, dear." And maybe, if they remembered, they would buy me a cheap burger from a fast food drive-thru. But when Serafina finally managed to pass her driving test on her third agonizing attempt, they threw a massive garden barbecue. They invited 40 people, bought a ridiculous amount of food, and presented her with the keys to a car. I learned very early on that love in the Ravenscroft household was a transactional currency, and my account was permanently overdrawn. I was just the dull background character in Serafina's shiny, perfect life. But as I stood in that courtroom, watching the color completely drain from my parents' faces as the judge watched my sister try to break into my home, I realized something important. They had made me invisible for 28 years. But today, right here in this room, they were finally going to see me. The delusion that Serafina was a fragile, special genius who just needed endless financial and emotional support started early, and it dictated every single dynamic in our household. During my secondary school years, I worked 20 grueling hours a week at a local Tesco. I spent my evenings smelling like old cardboard boxes and industrial floor wax, scanning barcodes until my eyes blurred just to afford basic things like decent shoes and school supplies. I had to buy my own heavily used, battered laptop for my programming classes because my parents looked me in the eye and said they simply could not afford to buy me a computer. Yet, mysteriously, just a few months later, when Serafina turned 18, she was gifted a brand new top-of-the-line MacBook Pro. This was despite the fact that she never used it for anything beyond posting filtered selfies on social media and watching endless hours of makeup tutorials. Serafina also received a steady monthly allowance of £200 just for existing as a part of the family. I asked for an allowance once when I was 15, hoping to cut back my supermarket hours so I could study more for my A-levels. My father laughed out loud and told me that character is built through hard work, not handouts. So, I worked. I poured all my deep resentment, all that burning, suffocating spite into my education. I quickly learned that spite is an incredibly powerful fuel if you know exactly how to channel it. I got accepted into Imperial College London for a rigorous computer science program. Every single penny of my tuition was paid for by academic scholarships, student loans, and working multiple part-time jobs simultaneously. Meanwhile, my university fund, the one my parents had supposedly been saving for both of us since we were children, went entirely toward Serafina's tuition at a private arts college. She lasted exactly 2 terms before she dropped out entirely because she simply refused to wake up for morning lectures. When I graduated with first-class honors at the absolute top of my entire graduating class, my parents actually showed up to the ceremony. I thought just for a brief foolish second that maybe they were finally proud of me. But they left halfway through the commencement speeches because Serafina called them crying hysterically. She needed help moving into her 3rd flat in 2 years, and it was an absolute emergency. They walked out of the hall before my name was even called across the loudspeaker. My career started at a small tech startup, making £45,000 a year. I lived in a tiny, cramped studio flat in Croydon, drove a 15-year-old rusty hatchback that rattled when I hit the motorway, ate rice and beans for dinner, and forcefully saved 30% of every single paycheck. Serafina, on the other hand, lived at home completely rent-free, crashed my mother's luxury SUV twice without consequence, and bounced between various retail jobs that she would quit the exact moment a manager asked her to work on a Saturday. By the time I was 26, I had strategically moved companies, negotiated aggressive raises, and landed a highly coveted role as a senior software architect at a major firm. My salary jumped to £250,000 a year, plus a very generous company equity package. I upgraded my life slightly but kept saving money like my life depended on it, because in my mind it absolutely did. I knew I had no safety net whatsoever. If I fell, my parents would just step right over my body to check on Serafina. After 5 years of working 7 zero-hour weeks and living far below my actual means, I had saved £500,000 in pure cash for a deposit. I did not tell my family about my promotions. I did not tell them about my rapidly growing savings account. I just quietly went to the bank, signed the massive stack of papers, and bought my ultimate sanctuary. It was a sprawling £2.5 million penthouse on the 30th floor of a luxury building in Canary Wharf. It had 2 spacious bedrooms, 2 massive bathrooms, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the River Thames and the London skyline. I hired a professional designer to custom furnish it to my exact taste. I built a massive home office equipped with 3 ultra-wide monitors. For the first time in my entire life, I had a physical space that was beautiful, peaceful, and entirely mine. Then I made the single biggest mistake of my adult life. In a weak, lingering moment of hoping for just basic parental approval, I invited my mother and father over to see it. They walked out of the private lift and stepped into my sleek, minimalist foyer. And immediately, the energy in my home shifted. It felt exactly like a bucket of freezing cold water had been dumped over my peaceful sanctuary. My mother did not say congratulations. She did not say she was proud of me or that the view was stunning or that my hard work had paid off. Instead, she immediately pulled out her phone and started taking rapid-fire photos of the master bathroom, specifically focusing on the expensive rainfall showerhead and the imported marble countertops. I could hear her phone chiming repeatedly as she texted the pictures directly to Serafina. My father walked over to the smart home integration panel mounted on the living room wall. He tapped the touchscreen a few times, frowned at the temperature settings, and then turned to me with a deeply sour look on his face. He asked very bluntly, with no preamble, exactly how much money I had paid for the place. Looking back, I know I shouldn't have told him. I should have changed the subject, but I did tell him. When the £2.5 million figure left my mouth, he actually scoffed out loud. He crossed his arms over his chest, looked around my pristine living room, and said, "Well, it must be nice to spend our money so frivolously." I stared at him, genuinely confused for a moment. I reminded him, keeping my voice as calm and steady as humanly possible, that I had bought this property entirely with my own earnings. Every single penny of the £500,000 deposit came directly from my personal bank account. He waved his hand at me dismissively, as if I were a child arguing about a toy. He looked me dead in the eye and said that their superior genetics had given me the intelligence required to earn that ridiculous salary in the first place. So technically, they had contributed to the purchase. They had built my brain, he argued, so they rightfully owned a significant share of the profits it generated. I thought he was making a terrible, tasteless joke. He was not. Exactly 2 weeks later, my building's concierge called up to my unit. He sounded incredibly stressed and apologetic. He said my parents and my sister were currently standing in the main lobby, loudly demanding to be led up to my floor. I told the concierge I was absolutely not expecting anyone and instructed him to send them away immediately, threatening to call building security if they refused to leave. For the next hour, my mobile phone absolutely exploded. My mother called me 17 times in a row. When I didn't answer, she began leaving increasingly hysterical voicemails. She screamed into the phone that I was being an ungrateful, selfish monster. She said Serafina was going through a really hard time and desperately needed a nice, stable place to live. The hard time, I later found out from a relative, was that my parents had finally, after 25 years, asked Serafina to contribute a tiny symbolic amount of rent, and she had thrown a massive house-destroying tantrum. My mother's final voicemail demanded that I pack my bags, move back into a cheap studio flat, and give Serafina the keys and access codes to the penthouse because she deserved to live somewhere beautiful to help her mental health. I blocked all of their phone numbers immediately. I poured myself a large glass of expensive wine, sat out on my balcony looking at the city lights, and assumed they would eventually give up when they realized I was completely ignoring them. I was wrong. The sheer audacity of blood relations is a terrifying thing. 2 days later, there was a sharp, aggressive knock on my front door. It wasn't my family. It was a man in a cheap, poorly fitting suit holding a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Alara Ravenscroft. When I said yes, he shoved the heavy envelope into my chest, said, "You have been served," and walked quickly away toward the lift. I opened it right there, standing in the hallway. It was a formal civil lawsuit. Alistair and Rowena Ravenscroft were suing me in the High Court, demanding the immediate legal transfer of my property to their names, officially claiming they had provided the deposit and that the penthouse rightfully belonged to my sister. The Cold War of my childhood was over. The actual war had officially begun. I walked slowly back into my living room, my legs feeling strangely numb and heavy, and dropped the massive stack of legal documents onto my pristine glass coffee table. The thought of the paper hitting the glass echoed in the quiet flat. I sat down on the edge of my sofa and forced myself to read through the claim, page by agonizing page. I was genuinely deeply impressed by the sheer unadulterated audacity printed in black and white. My parents, who I knew for a fact had maybe a total of £15,000 left in their retirement savings, were legally claiming to a judge that they had given me £500,000 in pure cash to buy this penthouse. Furthermore, they were arguing in a formal court document that Serafina's emotional well-being and housing needs legally superseded my right to property ownership. They actually paid a solicitor to write that ridiculous sentiment into a binding legal filing. I didn't cry. I didn't panic or throw things. My brain simply switched into developer mode. When a complex software program throws a massive, catastrophic error, you don't sit there and weep about how unfair it is. You pull up the system logs. You isolate the bugs causing the failure and you systematically destroy them line by line. I made a phone call to Valerie Sterling. She was a highly aggressive, widely recommended solicitor whose firm specialized exclusively in complex real estate litigation and property disputes. I went to her central London office the very next morning and handed her the thick manila envelope. Valerie sat behind her massive mahogany desk, adjusting her designer glasses and read through the entire claim in total silence for about 10 long minutes. When she reached the final page, she actually leaned back in her expensive leather chair and let out a loud, genuine laugh that startled me. She tossed the papers back onto the desk with a flick of her wrist. "This is without a doubt the most baseless, poorly constructed property grab I have seen in 15 years of practicing law," Valerie said, shaking her head in disbelief. "They are legally claiming they handed you over £500,000, but they have attached absolutely zero bank records, no canceled checks, and no wire transfer receipts. Nothing. The only supporting document is a signed affidavit from your uncle saying he heard they helped you out financially." I confirmed to her, looking her straight in the eye, that my parents had never given me a single penny toward the penthouse. In fact, they had never given me a pound for anything since the day I turned 18. Valerie looked at me, her expression turning incredibly sharp and serious. She folded her hands on the desk, leaning forward. Okay, Alara, we have two options here. We can file a quick motion to dismiss, drag them into a mediation room, and settle this quietly to make them go away with minimal drama. Or we can proceed to the discovery phase, drag every single piece of dirty laundry out into the glaring light of a courtroom and absolutely destroy them in front of a judge. What do you want to do? I looked out Valerie's office window at the London skyline. I thought about the storage room that smelled like rust. I thought about the university graduation ceremony they walked out of. I thought about my father standing in my living room confidently telling me my brain was his property. I turned back to Valerie, my voice dead calm and perfectly even. I want to destroy them. Leave absolutely nothing left of their argument. Valerie smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. Let's get to work then, she said. She immediately filed our response with the court, completely denying all of their claims and demanding strict, documented proof of the massive financial contributions my parents were alleging. Julian Vane, the solicitor my parents had somehow scraped up the money to hire, pushed back hard. He argued in his filings that there were deep verbal agreements and familial understandings that superseded mere paper trails. The judge assigned to our preliminary hearing allowed the case to proceed to discovery, likely assuming that once actual hard evidence was demanded, the whole ridiculous mess would resolve itself and they would drop the suit. That gave us exactly 6 weeks to prepare our weapons. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was incredibly enlightening, mostly because it exposed exactly how desperate, malicious, and fundamentally sloppy my family was willing to be to get what they wanted. I gave Valerie complete, unrestricted access to my entire financial life. I handed over years of tax returns, my employment contracts, my bank statements showing my salary being deposited every 2 weeks like clockwork, and the official transfer receipt showing the deposit moving directly from my personal savings account to the conveyancer. Valerie was thrilled with the documentation. You are an engineer, she said, flipping happily through the perfectly organized color-coded binders I had brought to her office. You document absolutely everything. Habit from debugging bad code, I replied flatly. Log every single event. When Julian Vane finally submitted my parents' supposed evidence, Valerie called me into her office immediately. She laid a small stack of printed emails on the conference table. My parents were submitting these as their smoking gun. They were prints of emails supposedly sent from my personal email address directly to my mother. The text in the emails explicitly promised that I was buying the Canary Wharf penthouse specifically for Serafina and that I would formally transfer the deed to her name within a year of completion. I stared at the papers, feeling a cold wave of disgust. I have never written these in my life, I said, pointing at the phrasing. Valerie nodded slowly. I know the wording is entirely different from how you communicate, but they look somewhat convincing on paper to a layman. I pulled out my laptop right there in her office. I asked Valerie to have Vane send over the electronic versions of the emails, claiming we needed them for our digital records review. As soon as the digital files hit my inbox, I opened the raw source code of the email headers. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the truth. I pointed at the screen so Valerie could see. Look at the metadata right here. These were not sent through my email provider's servers. They were generated using a temporary anonymous fake email website. And if you trace the originating IP address right here in the header block, I ran a quick IP lookup through a database. It traces directly to the internet service provider and the exact geographic location of my parents' house in the suburbs. They forged them from their own living room. Valerie's eyes lit up with dangerous, predatory excitement. Oh, the judge is going to absolutely crucify them for submitting forged documents to the court. But the forged emails were not even the best part of our arsenal. Because I loved smart home technology and because I valued my privacy, I had installed high-end, cloud-backed security cameras all around my penthouse door and inside my foyer the very day I moved in. I spent an entire weekend pulling the cloud logs for the last 2 months, reviewing hours of empty hallway footage. What I found made my blood run cold and then boil with absolute rage. I sat in Valerie's office and played the video clips for her on the big screen. April 28th, Serafina trying to pick the lock. May 3rd, my mother in the lobby screaming at the night concierge, waving a fake spare key that didn't even match my door brand. May 12th, 3:30 inches the morning. This was the worst one. Serafina showed up with a strange man I did not recognize. He was holding a heavy metal crowbar. The audio caught Serafina whispering clearly. Once we pry it open, we can just change the locks and say we were doing a welfare check. The man actually raised the crowbar toward my doorframe, ready to swing. But then he spotted the glowing red light of the security camera mounted above him. He grabbed Serafina's arm, pointed aggressively at the lens, and they both sprinted down the hallway toward the fire exit stairs. Valerie watched the footage in absolute silence. She pressed pause on the exact frame where the crowbar was raised. "Alara," Valerie said softly, her voice carrying a heavy, serious weight. "This is not just a civil property dispute anymore. This is documented, organized, attempted burglary. We compiled all 17 incidents of unauthorized entry attempts. We printed the IP traces proving the fake emails. We had everything bound in neat, terrifying little folders. We were ready for court." The hearing was scheduled for mid-June at the Royal Courts of Justice. I took the entire day off work, put on a sharp charcoal gray tailored suit, and arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. I wanted to be sitting there at the defense table looking perfectly calm and entirely unbothered when my family walked through those doors. My parents arrived wearing formal, stiff clothing, looking incredibly grim, like they were attending a funeral for their own dignity. Serafina waltzed in right behind them, wearing those same ripped jeans and a crop top, completely oblivious to the extreme gravity of the room. She spent the entire waiting period taking selfies in the hallway. Justice Sylvia Thornton was a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s. She had a terrifying reputation in the courthouse for absolutely shredding frivolous lawsuits and solicitors who wasted her time. She flipped through the massive stack of initial filings on her desk, adjusted her glasses, and glared down at Julian Vane. "Counselor," Justice Thornton said, her voice dripping with intense skepticism. "This appears to be a property dispute where your clients claim a massive financial contribution, but they have submitted exactly 0 bank records to support this claim. Would you care to explain this glaring omission before we proceed any further?" Julian Vane stood up, looking visibly nervous, and launched into a desperate, rambling speech about parental sacrifice. He talked about how my parents had fed and clothed me for 18 years, and how that lifelong investment entitled them to benefit from my current wealth. He painted Serafina as a struggling, vulnerable young woman who desperately needed stability, and painted me as a greedy, heartless tech executive hoarding resources from her own flesh and blood. Justice Thornton let him finish his emotional monologue without interrupting. Then she turned her piercing gaze to Valerie. Response. Valerie stood up looking completely relaxed and entirely in control. "Your Honor, the claimant's entire argument boils down to the absurd concept that because they raised their daughter, they legally own her assets. By that logic, every parent in this country could seize their adult children's bank accounts. But we do not need to debate philosophy today. We have conclusive, undeniable evidence." Valerie connected her laptop to the court's display screen. She systematically walked the judge through my tax returns, my payslips, and the bank transfers, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single penny used to buy that penthouse was mine. Then she pulled up the IP trace logs, demonstrating clearly that my parents had forged the emails from their own home router. I watched Julian Vane lean over and whisper furiously to my father. My father looked like he was going to be physically sick. He clearly had not told his own solicitor about the forgery, but the killing blow was the video compilation. Valerie played the security footage. The whole room watched Serafina try to pick the lock. They watched my mother harass the concierge. They watched the unknown man raise the heavy metal crowbar. Justice Thornton leaned so far forward over her bench I thought she might actually stand up. "Is that attempted burglary I am watching on my screen?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Yes, Your Honor," Valerie confirmed smoothly. 17 separate attempts by the claimants to illegally force entry into my client's home after filing this very lawsuit. My mother suddenly stood up from her chair, crying hysterically, abandoning all courtroom decorum. "She is our daughter. We raised her. She owes us this. Madam, sit down and be quiet." Justice Thornton slammed her heavy wooden gavel down so hard it made me jump. "You are doing yourself 0 favors." Serafina, finally realizing things were going disastrously wrong, started whining loudly. "This is so unfair. Alara has all this money and I have nothing. She is supposed to share with her family." Justice Thornton glared at Serafina with absolute unfiltered disgust. "Young lady, your sister's hard-earned assets are not community property for you to claim simply because you want them. Need does not create legal ownership." The judge didn't even need to retreat to her chambers to make a decision. She ruled from the bench right then and there. "This claim is dismissed with extreme prejudice," Justice Thornton announced, her voice sharp as broken glass. "The claimants presented fabricated evidence and engaged in what appears to be criminal harassment. The claimants are hereby ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees totaling exactly £35,000 within 90 days. Serafina completely lost her mind. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, black mascara running down her face, pointing violently at me across the room. "You ruined our family. That penthouse should be mine. You don't deserve it." The judge signaled the usher immediately. "Remove her from my courtroom," she ordered. Two armed court officers grabbed Serafina by the arms and dragged her out into the hallway. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, abruptly cutting off her screams, leaving my parents sitting in stunned, horrified silence. We had won. The absolute silence in the courtroom after Serafina was physically dragged out by the officers was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 28 years. My parents sat completely frozen at their table, staring blankly ahead. Julian Vane, their solicitor, was aggressively packing his files into his briefcase, refusing to even look at them. He had been thoroughly humiliated in front of a respected judge because his clients lied to him, and he was clearly permanently done with the Ravenscroft family. Valerie touched my shoulder lightly, gave me a victorious, knowing nod, and we walked out the side exit together. I stepped out into the bright London sunlight, took a deep cleansing breath of the damp city air, and felt a massive physical weight lift off my chest. But people who feel a deep toxic sense of entitlement rarely accept defeat gracefully. Psychologists call it an extinction burst. It is a phenomenon where a toxic behavior temporarily escalates to extreme desperate levels right before it finally dies out, simply because the boundary holds firm. My family was about to burst in spectacular fashion. The brutal financial reality of the judge's ruling hit them fast and hard. They had exactly 90 days to pay £35,000 in legal fees directly to me. A few weeks later, my Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, called me. She had been the one relative who always stayed quietly neutral during my childhood, never taking a side. But seeing the court documents and hearing about the forged emails had finally pushed her off the fence. "Alara," Aunt Linda said, her voice hushed and anxious over the phone. "I thought you should know. Your parents are in a complete financial crisis. They blew through whatever small savings they had just to pay Vane's retainer fee. To pay your court-ordered fees, they had to take out a high-interest second mortgage on their house in the suburbs." I listened to her, feeling absolutely nothing, no guilt, no joy, just the cold, logical processing of natural consequences. "They are drowning, Alara," she continued, sounding genuinely sad. "Your father had to come out of retirement. He took a part-time job working the timber aisle at a B&Q just to make the new monthly mortgage payments." I thanked Aunt Linda for the information and hung up the phone. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my living room, poured myself a large glass of expensive red wine, and watched the boats cross the dark water of the Thames. They had meticulously dug their own grave over 28 years. I was just refusing to jump into it with them. Serafina, however, decided that if she couldn't steal my house through the legal system, she would steal money from the internet by playing the ultimate tragic victim. A colleague from my tech company sent me a link one morning with a highly concerned message. Serafina had created a GoFundMe campaign. The title was written in all capital letters, "Family Court Stole My Home." I clicked the link and read the description. It was a wildly fabricated, incredibly dramatic story about how her evil, greedy millionaire tech executive sister had promised her a safe place to live, only to maliciously sue her, forge documents, and bribe a corrupt judge to throw her out on the street. She posted my full legal name, the exact area I lived in, and a highly edited, photoshopped picture of herself looking incredibly sad and malnourished. She was begging the internet for £40,000 to help her secure housing and recover from the severe emotional trauma I had supposedly caused her. I immediately took detailed screenshots of the entire page and sent them directly to Valerie. Valerie didn't even bother to file a legal motion in court. She just sent a sternly worded email directly to GoFundMe's legal department attaching Justice Thornton's official ruling and a formal notice of defamation. The campaign was permanently taken down within 2 hours for violating the platform's strict terms of service regarding fraud and harassment. Serafina had managed to raise exactly £240 from a few gullible strangers before the site locked the funds and refunded the donors. Serafina threw a massive tantrum on her social media, crying about how the rich elite control the internet and censor the truth. She was spiraling rapidly out of control, and the absolute worst part for her was that my parents no longer had the money to cushion her fall. My parents were entirely incapable of self-reflection. When faced with the catastrophic consequences of their own actions, their minds automatically scrambled to find a scapegoat. Since I had permanently removed myself from that role, they aimed their crosshairs at the next available target. They decided to sue their own solicitor. I received a formal, heavily worded letter from Julian Vane's law firm in late October. They were notifying me purely as a professional courtesy that Alistair and Rowena Ravenscroft had formally filed a professional negligence complaint against him with the Solicitors Regulation Authority. My parents were claiming that inadequate legal representation caused them to lose the property case. They wanted Vane to pay the £35,000 judgment plus additional damages for their severe emotional distress. It was a 40-page document of pure concentrated delusion, blaming everyone in the universe except themselves. Vane's official response to the SRA was absolutely devastating. He submitted detailed notes from every single client meeting, where he had explicitly warned them that their case was weak. He attached emails where he had practically begged them for actual evidence of their claimed £500,000 contribution, to which they had responded with vague rants about how family supports family. He included the exact moment during the discovery phase when he first learned about the attempted break-ins, noting that he had strongly recommended an immediate withdrawal, which my parents angrily rejected. The SRA took less than 60 days to make a ruling. The negligence complaint was dismissed with a written opinion stating the claim was wholly without merit and bordered on sanctionable conduct. They noted that no solicitor in the country could have won a case based on fabricated emails and attempted burglary. My parents were ordered to pay £2,000 toward the SRA's investigative costs. As their financial situation continued to deteriorate, the social consequences finally caught up with them. Christmas approached and Aunt Linda invited me to her annual holiday party. She had specifically explicitly disinvited my parents and Serafina after they tried to make their attendance conditional on me being banned. Aunt Linda told them it was her home and if they could not behave like civilized adults, they could sit in their house alone. I went to that party wearing a beautiful emerald dress, feeling lighter than I had in years. 15 relatives attended. Many of them had historically taken my parents' side, or simply turned a blind eye to the blatant favoritism. But court records are public, and gossip spreads fast. Almost every single person approached me privately near the dessert table or by the fireplace to apologize. They apologized for not recognizing the favoritism sooner, for not speaking up when they witnessed my parents mistreating me, and for briefly believing my parents' lies about the penthouse. My uncle, who had always been my father's closest confidant, pulled me aside. He told me my father had called him asking for a £20,000 loan, claiming I had ruined them financially out of pure spite. My uncle looked at me and said, "I told your father I read the court documents. I told him he ruined himself by suing his own daughter for property that was not his. He hung up on me. We have not spoken since." That conversation felt like true vindication. It was not just the legal court victory, but the moment when my extended family finally openly acknowledged the reality I had lived through. The golden child versus scapegoat dynamic had been visible to everyone for decades. They had just chosen not to challenge it. Now, they could not deny it because it had been legally documented, proven in court, and stamped by a judge. Serafina simply could not stand the fact that the world was moving on without her at the center of it. She had been fired from yet another retail job right before the holidays for excessive absences and arguing with her shift manager. She was unemployed, completely broke, and living in a tense house with parents who could no longer afford to fund her lifestyle. On Valentine's Day, she decided to seek attention the only way she knew how. She posted a massive, unhinged rant on her public Facebook page. It was a sprawling essay detailing exactly how I had stolen her future and ruined her life. She wrote extensively about the luxury penthouse she had been promised, the lawsuit that corrupt judges had unfairly dismissed, and her current poverty, which she claimed was entirely 100% my fault. She did not stop there. She tagged my full name. She tagged the official company page of the tech firm where I worked. She posted the name of my residential building. And she tagged several of our mutual relatives. She called me a thief, a sociopath, and a corporate fraud. It was bitter. It was pathetic. And most importantly, it was highly legally actionable. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single paragraph, every tag, and every comment before she inevitably deleted it. I sent the entire package to Valerie. Valerie called me back within 10 minutes. She sounded genuinely amused. "This is textbook defamation," Valerie said. "She has made false public statements about you that could actively damage your professional reputation in the tech industry. We can pursue a restraining order right now without waiting for her to show up at your door with another crowbar." We filed the paperwork immediately. The restraining order hearing was far simpler than the property lawsuit. We were assigned to Justice Alistair Graves, an older man with absolutely zero patience for internet drama. Valerie presented Serafina's social media posts, the previous security footage of the attempted break-ins, and the clear escalating pattern of harassment. Serafina actually showed up to court without a solicitor. She stood at the podium and tried to argue that her post was just free speech about her difficult family problems. Justice Graves read her Facebook post aloud in the quiet courtroom, every single accusation about me being a thief, every claim about promised property, every insult. When he finished reading, he took off his glasses and stared down at her. "Miss Ravenscroft," Justice Graves said, his voice deep and stern, "you were party to a lawsuit where these exact claims were thoroughly dismissed. A judge ruled definitively that your sister owns her property free and clear. Now you are publicly calling her a thief and trying to damage her employment. That is not free speech. That is defamation and targeted harassment." Serafina tried to argue, her voice rising in a familiar whine. "But it is not fair. She has everything." Justice Graves cut her off instantly. "Your financial situation is not this court's concern, and it absolutely does not give you the right to harass your sister. I am granting a strict 2-year restraining order. You are prohibited from contacting Alara Ravenscroft directly or indirectly. No phone calls, no emails, no text messages, no social media posts about her, and absolutely no third-party contact. You are to stay 150 meters away from her at all times. If you violate this order, it will result in immediate criminal charges. Do you understand?" Serafina started crying, real tears this time as the officer handed her the paperwork. A month later, the final shoe dropped on my parents' financial crisis. Unable to keep up with the second mortgage they took out to pay my legal fees, they were forced to sell their suburban house to avoid repossession. They netted barely enough to pay off their debts and buy a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom park home in a much less desirable area an hour outside the city. The three of them were now trapped in a small box together. Two people who had enabled a monster, and the monster they had created. My professional life was completely shielded from the chaotic dumpster fire of my biological family. In May, I was offered a massive promotion. The board of directors selected me for the position of vice president of engineering. It was a role I had been quietly working toward for years, but seeing it on paper was still shocking. The compensation package was staggering. My base salary was increased to £400,000 a year, plus performance bonuses and a massive grant of stock options that would vest over 4 years. If the company went public as planned, those options would be worth millions. But stepping into that glass corner office triggered something deeply buried inside me. Imposter syndrome hit me like a freight train. I found myself sitting in executive meetings looking at the brilliant people around me and waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and expose me as a fraud. I started working 8 zero-hour weeks just to prove I deserved to be there. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma. She helped me unpack the fact that this lingering doubt was a direct result of growing up in a house where I was constantly told I was less valuable. When your parents spend 28 years acting like your achievements are accidents and your existence is a burden, your brain physically wires itself to expect failure. I had to consciously, painfully rewrite that code. Meanwhile, Serafina could not handle the silence. The restraining order explicitly forbade her from contacting me or posting about me, but her obsession had mutated. I discovered it when a colleague mentioned seeing strange comments on my company's official LinkedIn page celebrating my promotion. I logged in and checked. Someone with the username Raven had commented, "Nepotism and family theft built this career under my announcement." I knew instantly who it was. I documented it, took a screenshot, and reported it to LinkedIn for harassment via a fake account. The profile was removed within 24 hours. But Serafina had nothing but time. 3 days later, another account appeared. This time, it was an account named Truth, seeker posting on industry articles about tech salaries, leaving comments about how some executives get ahead by stealing from their poor families. I reported that one, too. It became a bizarre, pathetic pattern. She would create a fake account. I would find it, screenshot it, and report it. It would be deleted. She would create another one. I created a dedicated encrypted folder on my personal laptop just to store the screenshots. Valerie advised me to keep meticulous records but not to engage under any circumstances. She is violating the restraining order with this indirect contact, Valerie explained over coffee. But police rarely act on fake accounts unless there is a direct physical threat. Keep building the file. When she eventually escalates, and she will, we will drop a mountain of evidence on her. Over the next 6 months, the folder grew. By the end of the year, I had documented exactly 43 separate fake accounts, 43 ghosts haunting the digital edges of my life, desperately trying to pull me back down into the dirt with them. But I just kept climbing higher. September brought an unexpected, terrifying complication that threatened everything I had built. I was sitting at my desk reviewing architecture diagrams when my phone rang. It was the company's general counsel asking me to come to the executive conference room immediately. When I walked in, the general counsel and the vice president of human resources were sitting at the long table. Between them sat a thick, unmarked manila envelope. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what that envelope looked like. "Someone sent this anonymously to our corporate headquarters mailroom this morning," the general counsel said, his voice carefully neutral. It was addressed directly to the board of directors. He slid the contents across the table. It was a massive stack of printed papers. Someone had printed out every single court document from my family's property lawsuit, but they had heavily, maliciously edited them. They had blacked out the judge's final ruling and instead inserted fake typed letters claiming that I was severely mentally unstable due to violent family conflicts. The letter suggested I was a pathological liar, that I was under criminal investigation for elder abuse, and that I was completely unfit for corporate leadership. I sat in that cold conference room feeling the humiliating heat rise in my cheeks and explained my family history for the second time in 2 years. I provided the full context about the lawsuit, the restraining order, and the pattern of harassment via the 43 fake social media accounts. I pulled up my secure cloud drive and showed them the actual unedited court rulings signed by Justice Thornton and Justice Graves. They were sympathetic, but I could see the deep corporate concern in their eyes. A vice president involved in messy public drama is a liability. I volunteered to resign right then and there. I told them I refused to let my toxic family damage the company's reputation or distract from our engineering goals. The CEO, who had dialed into the meeting remotely, spoke up through the speakerphone. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "We hired you based on your exceptional skills and your track record of delivering results. Your family's psychotic harassment campaign is not your fault, and it will not affect your position here. But we do need to ensure this does not escalate to physical danger at our offices." The company immediately hired a private corporate security consultant to assess the threat level. He reviewed everything and concluded this was a reputation damage attempt, not an imminent physical threat. Valerie, however, was furious. "This is criminal harassment and potentially stalking," she said. "They are contacting your employer with forged documents intended to destroy your career." We filed formal police reports with the Metropolitan Police that afternoon. The detective assigned to the case requested all my documentation, but the investigation moved agonizingly slowly. The return address on the package was fake. The postmark showed it had been mailed from a random post office in a completely different city. The handwriting on the label was carefully printed in block letters. The detective's assessment was that it was likely my parents working together or Serafina using a friend to mail it. But without surveillance footage from that specific post office, proving exactly which family member physically dropped the envelope into the mail slot was nearly impossible. I had to live with the paranoid feeling that my family was out there in the dark, constantly watching my career moves, plotting the next attempt to sabotage my life. The frustration of failing to get me fired pushed them to a new extreme. In October, a colleague sent me a direct message with just a link and a question mark. I clicked it, and my blood turned to ice. Someone had created a professional-looking website. The domain name was literally thetruthaboutolarravenscroft.co.uk. The homepage featured my professional corporate headshot stolen right off my LinkedIn profile alongside old, unflattering family photos from my childhood. The site was filled with wildly distorted, completely fabricated information about the lawsuit. It claimed I had manipulated the court proceedings by sleeping with lawyers. It claimed my parents had given me their entire life savings and I had repaid them by hiring thugs to intimidate them. It stated as a fact that I had forged the security footage and bribed building officials. The About page claimed the site was run by a coalition of concerned citizens who knew me personally and wanted to warn the tech industry about my sociopathic tendencies. But the phrasing, the specific grievances, the endless whining about fairness, it was obviously my family. The website violated multiple laws: defamation, malicious communications, and cyberstalking. Valerie immediately filed an emergency claim against the anonymous site operators while simultaneously requesting an emergency takedown order from the website hosting company. The hosting company refused to take it down without a court order, citing free speech. We got that court order within 48 hours. Justice Graves reviewed the site's content alongside my massive documentation folder of ongoing harassment. His official order to the hosting company was scathing, calling the site baseless, defamatory content clearly and maliciously intended to harm the claimant's professional reputation. The site went dark 3 days after it launched, but damage on the internet is permanent. Screenshots had circulated. Several people in my professional network sent me links asking if I had seen it. I had to explain over and over again that it was targeted harassment from a deranged, mentally unstable family. Every single explanation felt like ripping open a healed wound. The forensic investigation into the website's creation revealed it had been registered using a free offshore proxy service that hid the owner's true identity. The payment for the hosting had been made with a prepaid gift card purchased with cash. The initial setup had been done from a public library computer. Someone had thought very carefully about how to avoid identification. This was not an impulsive emotional outburst. This was planned, methodical, calculated sabotage. But arrogant people always make mistakes. They always want credit for their destructive work. In November, Serafina posted on her monitored private Instagram account. The caption read, "Finally taking action to get justice after 2 years of being silenced by corrupt courts. The truth always comes out." Attached to the post was a screenshot of the now-defunct website's homepage. She had posted it while the site was live, bragging to her small circle of followers about her masterpiece. She had essentially confessed to the crime publicly, apparently believing that her private account was safe and that the offshore proxy service made her legally untouchable. I took screenshots of the post before she could delete it and forwarded them immediately to Valerie. Valerie sent them directly to the police detective. The detective contacted Serafina by phone. According to the police report, Serafina initially denied all involvement. Then, when confronted with the screenshot, she claimed she had only shared a link someone else had sent her. Finally, after an hour of questioning, she broke down and angrily admitted she had helped build the content because someone needed to tell the world the truth about her sister. That admission was the final nail in her coffin. Combined with the 2-year pattern of harassment, the 43 fake accounts, and the forged documents sent to my employer, the Crown Prosecution Service agreed to file charges. An arrest warrant was issued for Serafina Ravenscroft. Serafina was arrested at her parents' cramped park home 2 days before Christmas. According to the police report, she screamed, fought the officers, and had to be physically carried out to the squad car in handcuffs while my mother wailed on the front lawn. My Aunt Linda called me crying after seeing the arrest record online. "This has gone too far, Alara," she pleaded. "Serafina is in a jail cell. Your parents are beside themselves. They are old and sick with stress. Can you please just call the prosecutor and drop the charges? Work this out as a family." I felt a surge of cold, hardened anger that I had been suppressing for months. "Aunt Linda," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "They sued me for property I bought myself. They tried to break into my home with a crowbar. They sent forged letters to my company board trying to destroy my career. They created a website accusing me of crimes. At what exact point does working it out as a family stop being my responsibility?" She was quiet for a long time. "You are right," she finally whispered. "I am sorry. I just hate seeing everyone suffer." "I am not suffering," I told her firmly. "I am thriving despite their relentless attempts to destroy me. They are suffering because consequences finally caught up with their behavior." Serafina's hearing was scheduled for early January. She appeared before a judge via a video feed from the prison looking haggard, wearing a gray prison tracksuit and crying uncontrollably. She pleaded not guilty to charges of cyberstalking and criminal harassment. Bail was set at £30,000. My parents immediately posted the required bond, likely completely draining their final, desperate emergency savings to bring their golden child home. The judge granted strict conditions of release: no contact with me whatsoever, surrender of all electronic devices, and absolutely no internet access. But the preliminary forensic examination of Serafina's confiscated phone and laptop revealed far more than I ever expected. The detectives found the smoking gun that proved she had not acted alone. They uncovered a massive, undeleted text message thread between Serafina and my mother. The thread dated back months. In it, my mother explicitly encouraged Serafina to make me understand what I had done to the family. Worse, my mother had been the one to look up the exact names of my company's board of directors and provided the corporate mailing address so Serafina could send the forged documents. My mother had actively discussed strategies for exposing my lies to the tech industry. The text thread showed at minimum my mother's full knowledge of the harassment. At maximum, it proved she was an active, willing participant in the conspiracy to destroy my life. The prosecutor did not hesitate. He filed additional charges against my mother as an accomplice to criminal harassment. Another arrest warrant was issued. Another humiliating court appearance followed. My father claimed complete ignorance of all of it, swearing to the police that his wife and daughter had kept him entirely in the dark. But phone records showed he had been on lengthy calls with both of them during the exact periods when the harassment was being actively planned. The prosecutor ultimately did not charge him due to a lack of written evidence, but he was formally listed as an unindicted co-conspirator. I sat in the back row of the courtroom for my mother's hearing. She looked 20 years older than she had at the property lawsuit hearing just a few years ago. Her hair was completely gray, her posture defeated. Her solicitor argued she was a confused, elderly woman who had been manipulated by her troubled daughter. The prosecutor simply held up the printed text messages showing clear malicious intent and calculated planning. Bail was set for my mother at £40,000. My father had to go to a high-interest lender, likely putting a lien on their park home just to keep his wife out of a jail cell pending trial. They had burned their entire lives to the ground just to try and singe my clothes. The trial for Serafina's cyberstalking and harassment charges began in February of the following year. The prosecutor had offered my mother a plea deal to avoid jail time given her age and lack of prior criminal history. She took it immediately. She pleaded guilty to being an accomplice to harassment. Her sentence was 3 years of strict probation, mandatory psychiatric counseling, and a permanent legally binding restraining order, forbidding her from ever contacting me again. She stood before the court sobbing as the judge told her that enabling her daughter's criminal behavior while participating herself showed a profound, disgusting failure of parental judgment. Serafina, however, refused all plea deals. In her deeply arrogant mind, she still believed she could convince a jury of 12 strangers that she was completely justified in terrorizing me. She insisted on going to a full trial. The prosecution's case was methodical, clinical, and absolutely devastating. They presented the massive timeline of harassment, starting with the attempted break-ins at my penthouse, progressing through the 43 fake accounts, the poisoned mail sent to my employer, and culminating in the defamatory website. Each incident was backed by screenshots, security footage, and forensic data from her own devices. Serafina took the stand against her solicitor's desperate advice. She immediately began crying, telling the jury a tragic story about growing up in my shadow, watching me get everything while she struggled. The prosecutor destroyed her on cross-examination. He asked her to confirm who had the larger bedroom. He asked who had their tuition paid for. He asked who received an allowance. Serafina was forced to admit under oath that she had received every financial and emotional advantage our parents had to offer while I had worked in a supermarket to buy my own laptop. When asked why she targeted me, Serafina's answer sealed her fate. She said, "She got to be the smart one, the successful one." Everyone praised her for her career while I was just the struggling daughter. She made me look bad just by existing. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, I exercised my legal right as a victim to give an impact statement. I stood at the podium in a tailored suit and spoke directly to the judge. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "Serafina Ravenscroft has spent years attempting to destroy my professional reputation, my sense of physical security, and my peace of mind. She did this not because I harmed her, but because I succeeded where she failed. She grew up receiving every advantage while I was treated as an afterthought. I built a successful career through my own relentless effort. She wanted me to fail so she could feel better about her own mediocrity. I asked the court to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of her malicious actions." Justice Graves listened, nodded, and delivered the sentence. He noted her absolute lack of remorse and her obsessive entitlement. He sentenced Serafina to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Serafina screamed as the officers put her in handcuffs. She yelled that I was the one who destroyed the family as they dragged her away to begin her sentence. 2 years have passed since that day. My parents declared total bankruptcy shortly after the criminal trials. The combination of legal fees, court costs, depleted retirement savings, and loans destroyed them financially. They lost their park home and were forced to move into a tiny, dilapidated caravan in a seaside town in the north to survive on their state pensions. They have no friends, no reputation, and no daughters. One is locked in a cell, and the other is permanently gone. Meanwhile, my tech company went public last spring. My vested stock options netted me over £6 million after taxes. My total net worth at 32 years old now exceeds £10 million. I paid off my London penthouse completely. Last month I got married. We held the small, elegant ceremony right here in my living room, surrounded by 30 close friends and colleagues who genuinely love and support me. Aunt Linda was the only biological relative in attendance. On clear evenings, I stand on my balcony with my husband. We drink expensive wine and watch the city lights shimmer over the Thames as the sun sets behind the Shard. The air is quiet and peaceful up here on the 30th floor. I look around at this beautiful fortress of glass and steel that I built with my own hands, my own brain, and my own relentless spite. My parents demanded my home. The judge read my evidence, and they lost everything. And I get to live with that beautiful, perfect vindication every single day.